We've all heard the jokes about Napoleon being short, leading to the concept of a Napoleon Complex. The idea that shorter men are aggressive or domineering as a way of compensating for their height. But was Napoleon actually short for his time? And if not, then why do we all think that? Let's start with the briefest of histories of the man in question. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Corsica, educated in France, and became an impressive, successful, and ambitious general. He studied the classics and fancied himself like his idols, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He lived through the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, narrowly escaping the same fate as Maximilien Robespierre. But because of his successes on the battlefield, his personal ambitions of greatness, and the absolute chaos of post-revolutionary France, he was able to work his way into becoming first consul of France with the coup d'etat, and eventually elected emperor for life. His rule is marked with just non-stop territorial expansion, as France's revolution ticked off monarchs around Europe and constantly were declaring war on France. He had many victories, but a handful of crucial losses, including his disastrous campaign into Russia, and later his defeat at Waterloo at the hands of the British. And so much more. This is an absolute bare-bones summary of a very fascinating and complex man. His empire, at its height, covered a good chunk of Europe, including Spain, the Low Countries, part of Italy, the vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire, and more. And as such, he gained a lot of enemies, and some of these enemies drew and distributed caricatures of the man to tarnish his reputation, and it's primarily from these images that we get the idea he was short. So was he? Let's dive a little deeper. Napoleon was roughly 5 foot 6 inches, or 167 centimeters, which is average height for a man in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And a quick Google search told me that today's average height is 5'7", or 171 centimeters. But back then, 5'6" was pretty average. So no, he wasn't overwhelmingly short.
Nice.
So let's talk about the reasons why people thought he was. First, the cartoons. There were many political cartoons belittling Napoleon precisely because he was such a major and divisive figure in the early 19th century European political sphere. Half of Europe was at war, collectively called the Napoleonic Wars, so mentions of Napoleon were everywhere. But one British cartoonist seemed to really dictate our mental image of Napoleon, and his name was James Gilray. These are some of his works. The 1803 print titled Maniac Ravings, or Little Boney in a Strong Fit, shows Napoleon with a relatively small stature when compared to the objects around him, having a fit. It's a response to a rant that Napoleon had in the presence of the British ambassador, Lord Whitworth, at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. That's really hard to say. Palace in Paris. It was his official residence. Now, Napoleon lost his cool and vented about the British government, but he did it in front of around 200 people, and it was not something that diplomats and political leaders should be doing in front of other people. That's actually why he had so many enemies outside of France and within France, is because they didn't see him as, what's the word I want to use, couth enough? He lost his temper a lot. So Gilray drew his political cartoon of Napoleon losing his cool, looking absolutely tiny and overwhelmed, and not what the leader of France should look like. This next image is called The Plum Pudding in Danger, or State Epicures Taking une Petite Souper. It shows the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger on the left, and Napoleon on the right. Now, William Pitt was super anti-Napoleon, but that's a story for another day. And you see the two men are carving up spheres of influence around the globe. The British are focusing on the Americas and have a much larger piece, and as a result, Pitt looks calm and composed. He doesn't have to fight for what he's taking, right? Napoleon, on the other hand, is carving up a much smaller chunk, that of mainland Europe, and he looks manic. And he's also half the size of his British counterpart. So if we look at these images, we get the sense that Napoleon was a small guy, and throughout these political cartoons he gets smaller and smaller. But we have to consider the context. These are British political cartoons, meant to make him look bad. He's the enemy, after all. For the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars, the Brits were picking off French forces in the Mediterranean and off the coast of Spain, like the British naval victory at Trafalgar, which Napoleon was not physically at, by the way. He was busy fighting in Ulm, a battle he won that led to the surrender of the Austrian army and the eventual capture of Vienna, at least in that point in time. They go to war again later on. So these images were part of a propaganda campaign to make Napoleon look weak, fallible, small. How did Napoleon react to these, you may wonder? Not well. I mean, who would, right? Now, one of the things Napoleon was famous for was writing notes and letters. We have a lot of them, and that's why we know so much about this very complex man. He wrote so many of them in the course of his tenure as leader of France in his various capacities, sometimes dozens a day, to various people. He was a master of compartmentalizing. He could write sappy love letters to his wife or mistress in 1 minute, and then order battle plans in the next, and then write to a conquered territory to tell them how to set up museums and create education plans. He was a big-time micromanager, and he had an eye for detail. So to have his enemy depict him in this way and belittle him in a way that would hurt diplomatic relations was unacceptable. He sent tons of letters across to his British counterparts, demanding they censor the press, as he had occasionally done in France, but of course they refused. Why would they listen to their enemy? Now, some people also point to one of his nicknames as evidence that he was short. Sometimes his men would call him Le Petit Caporal, or the Little Corporal. According to Napoleon expert and historian Andrew Roberts, this began during Napoleon's Italian campaign, which he embarked on 2 days after his wedding to Josephine, his first wife. That's a whole big thing, maybe for another day. Now, after he and his army stormed the bridge at Lodi, he was celebrated, and he was, at least in the beginning, very much loved by his men. The nickname Le Petit Caporal wasn't a slight against him for being little, it was a loving epithet, affectionate teasing. Andrew Roberts notes that Caesar's men did it to Caesar as well. Napoleon even encouraged it, actually, because it helped build a bond between him and his men, giving him even more power because he had an army with a personal connection to him. His men loved him, and at least for the bulk of the Napoleonic Wars, not so much the end, they would do anything for him. It was central to the Napoleonic legend, something he was crafting in the shadow of Caesar and Alexander. He wanted to foster an esprit de corps, or team spirit, some camaraderie, right? And he did that by having his men poke fun at him. It made him accessible, which boosted morale, which made him a more successful general. So the idea that Le Petit Caporal was an actual insult and a reference to his height is nonsense. People just get that from taking it out of context. Like I keep telling you guys, context is the most important thing. Without it, there's no way to see the bigger picture. Another thing that doesn't help is the fact that his height was recorded as 5'2", 5 foot 2 inches at least, but this was not a mistake. In the old French measurement system, yeah, he was 5'2", but that system wasn't the system we use now, which places him at 5'6". It wasn't regulated, it wasn't standard, it's not the same system, so if he was 5'2" back then, it doesn't mean he's 5'2" now. So despite the propaganda, Napoleon was not overwhelmingly short. Shorter than some other men? Sure, you can't always be the tallest, but he was normal height. But the political cartoons worked, and today we use Napoleon Complex to describe someone short and angry. Sometimes even small dogs, like Chihuahuas. They have a serious Napoleon Complex, in the way that we use that phrase anyway. And even if, again, the subject behind that phrase wasn't actually short, the phrase Napoleon Complex lives on. Now, Napoleon was no stranger to using propaganda to control his people. For example, when he saw this incredibly famous portrait by the esteemed artist Jacques-Louis David, he ordered several more. But it didn't make a difference in the end. He was seen as short, and because of his ignominious end, dying of stomach cancer on St. Helena, a defeated man, ousted from his French throne, replaced with the Bourbon French royal family again, the perspective of the winning side, which was the Brits, was what survived. And that's wild too, short little tangent, that's pretty crazy to me. The French Rev led to the guillotining death of the French king, Louis XVI, right? But then after the Revolutionary years, the Reign of Terror, the Napoleonic Wars, and his French Empire, France went right back to the Bourbons. And they put Louis XVI's brother on the throne, Louis XVIII. And then when he died, the third brother took power. The French monarchy was only permanently abolished in 1848 when another series of revolutions swept through Europe. What a wild 60 years of French history. But at least now we know that Napoleon wasn't short, and that 5'6" was, and is, a perfectly normal and average height. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this APHOUT mini on whether or not Napoleon was short, which he wasn't. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Sources for this episode are in the description, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.